Court records confirm it. A man locked in a concrete cell for 23 hours a day. No phone. No visitors. No sunlight. No contact with the outside world beyond the steel door in front of him. And yet, according to federal investigators, he was still running one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in California history. From inside a 6 by 11-foot cell at the end of the earth. Pelican Bay State Prison sits at the very top of California. Crescent City. A town most people have never heard of, on a coastline that feels like the edge of the world. It was built in 1989 for a single purpose. To house the men the rest of the prison system could no longer control. Its security housing unit, the SHU, became the most feared isolation block in the United States. Inmates confined there spent 22.5 hours every single day alone in a windowless cell. No congregate activities. No prison jobs. No rehabilitation programs. Just concrete, silence, and time. California corrections officials told the public it was working. That the men inside had been neutralized. That the wall between those cells and the streets of California was absolute. But what federal prosecutors would later document, in courtroom after courtroom, indictment after indictment, told a completely different story. The SHU had not cut the line. In some cases, it had simply moved the command center underground. In this documentary, you are going to hear 7 names. 7 men with verified, documented connections to Pelican Bay. 7 cases drawn from court records, federal indictments, and official prison documentation. 7 stories that together reveal something about this facility, and about organized crime in America, that most people have never been told. But before we get to the first name, there is a detail buried inside one federal case file that investigators themselves described as unlike anything they had encountered before. A detail about how far one man's reach extended from inside that cell. How many people were moving on his orders. How much money was flowing because of instructions passed through a system that was supposed to make all of that impossible. That detail is coming. And there is something else. One of the men in this documentary did not arrive at Pelican Bay as a foot soldier. He arrived as one of the most powerful organized crime figures in California, already convicted, already sentenced, and the system placed him there believing isolation would end his influence. What the records show happened next is something the facility's own administrators could not fully explain. You might think that a man stripped of every privilege, locked in solitary confinement, cut off from every known associate, you might think that man is finished. According to the federal case files you are about to hear, you would be wrong. This is Pelican Bay. And these are the men they could not silence.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
His real name was Joseph Madugarac. Born April 10, 1929, in San Pedro, California. The youngest of 4 children. The son of Croatian immigrants. His father, Gergo, was a truck driver who had crossed an ocean to build something in America. Shortly after Joseph was born, Gergo naturalized as a United States citizen and changed the family name to Morgan. Anti-immigrant sentiment was running hard in those years, and a Slavic name was a liability. So the family became Morgan. And Joseph became Joe. It should have been the beginning of something ordinary. It was not. Joe Morgan grew up in Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles. A neighborhood that was part Croatian, part Mexican, part everything the city had pushed to its edges. His mother raised him Catholic. She raised him in the church. But the streets of Boyle Heights had their own education, and Joe Morgan was an attentive student. By the late 1930s, when Morgan was still a child, he had already joined the Moravia street gang. One of the oldest documented street gangs in all of Los Angeles. He was not yet 10 years old. He grew up among Mexican-American kids. He spoke like them. He moved like them. He understood the codes and the loyalties of that world in a way that most outsiders never could. Despite being white, a Croatian kid from a Catholic immigrant family, Joe Morgan was, in every way that mattered on those streets, one of them. That identity would define everything that came after. By the time he was a teenager, Morgan was already demonstrating something that would mark his entire life. A capacity for extreme violence, combined with a cold and calculating mind. He did not lose himself in rage. He thought. He planned. And then he acted. In 1946, Morgan was 17 years old when he became entangled in a situation that would send him to prison for the first time. According to documented records, he had become involved with a woman who was 32 years old, 15 years his senior. At some point, Morgan beat the woman's husband to death with a tire iron. He buried the body in a shallow grave in the hills above Malibu. He was 17 years old. He was arrested, but even then, the intelligence that would define his criminal career showed itself. While awaiting trial in the Los Angeles County Jail, Morgan studied the situation around him. He identified a fellow inmate who was scheduled for transfer to a juvenile forestry camp. According to records, Morgan used that inmate's identification papers to walk out of the facility. He was recaptured. Convicted of second-degree murder, he was sentenced to 9 years at San Quentin State Prison. He was still a teenager when he arrived. San Quentin would not break Joe Morgan. It would build him. Inside San Quentin, Morgan entered one of the most dangerous prison environments in the United States. He was a young, white man in a facility where race determined survival. But Morgan had an advantage almost no other white inmate possessed. He was not perceived as white by the Mexican-American population inside. He was one of them. He moved with them. He was trusted by them. He served his 9 years and paroled in 1955. He lasted 1 year on the outside. In 1956, according to court records, Morgan walked into a bank in West Covina, California, and robbed it at gunpoint, using a machine gun. He made off with $17,000. He was caught. And during the robbery or its aftermath, according to testimony later provided by Rene "Boxer" Enriquez, a Mexican Mafia member who would himself become a federal informant, Morgan was shot in the leg. He lost the leg. Prison officials gave him a nickname after that. They called him Pegleg. Nobody called him that to his face. He was sent back to prison. And inside those walls, something was forming that would consume the rest of his life entirely. In 1957, at the Dual Vocational Institution in Tracy, California, a group of Mexican-American inmates formed an organization. They called it the Mexican Mafia. LAIM. It began as a prison gang, a structure for protection, for control, for power within the prison system itself. It was brutal from its first days. Membership required demonstrated violence. Loyalty was enforced through bloodshed. Morgan moved through the California prison system through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, accumulating influence, accumulating alliances, accumulating a reputation that preceded him into every facility he entered. In 1961, Morgan was transferred from Folsom State Prison to the Los Angeles County Jail to testify on behalf of another prisoner. What happened next entered prison legend. According to documented accounts, Morgan led 11 inmates in a jailbreak, escaping through a pipe shaft in the facility, using hacksaw blades he had hidden inside his prosthetic leg. 11 men. Through a pipe shaft. With blades smuggled inside an artificial limb. He was recaptured. Again. By 1969, Joe Morgan had been in and out of California's prison system for more than 2 decades. He was 40 years old. And in 1969, he was formally inducted into the Mexican Mafia, becoming, according to all documented accounts, the first non-Hispanic member ever accepted into LAIM. He was given the Aztec name CISO. It was a historic moment inside one of the most feared criminal organizations in the country. And it was only the beginning of what Morgan would do. Inside the prison system, Morgan began to see the Mexican Mafia the way a corporate strategist might see a company with unlimited potential and chaotic management. He understood that violence alone was not an organization. He wanted structure. He wanted hierarchy. He wanted the kind of insulated leadership model he had studied from a distance, the Italian-American organized crime families who ran operations without ever touching the crimes themselves. Morgan began building that model inside LAIM. He established relationships with the Aryan Brotherhood, the dominant white prison gang in California's system. According to documented accounts, Morgan's unique position, a white man trusted completely by LAIM's Mexican-American leadership, made him the ideal bridge between organizations that would otherwise have been adversaries. He brokered a working alliance between LAIM and the Aryan Brotherhood, with the Black Guerrilla family, the dominant black prison gang, serving as the mutual opposition. He also built connections outside the prison walls. According to multiple documented accounts, Morgan developed relationships with cocaine and heroin suppliers in Mexico, establishing supply lines for narcotics distribution that would eventually reach across California and beyond. He is documented as having established a connection with the AIU drug cartel in Mexico, helping secure a steady pipeline of Mexican black tar heroin for LAIM's distribution networks. He also reportedly established diplomatic contact with the Los Angeles crime family through a figure named Michael Rizzatello, an Italian-American organized crime associate. Morgan's ambition was not simply to run a prison gang. He wanted LAIM to operate as a transnational organized crime syndicate. From inside a prison cell. In 1971, according to documented records, the Mexican Mafia carried out the first prison gang street execution in the history of Los Angeles. The killing was organized and directed from inside the prison system. Morgan's fingerprints, not literally, but strategically, were on the evolution of LAIM's reach from inside the walls to the streets outside. The California prison system could not contain what Morgan was building. But it kept trying. In 1977, Morgan's life sentence became inevitable. According to court records, Morgan sought to arrange the murder of a drug dealer in Seal Beach, California. The dealer had failed to pay money owed to the Mexican Mafia. Morgan, seeking to enforce the organization's financial interests, turned to a fellow LAIM member named Ramon Mundo Mendoza to carry out the killing. He supplied Mendoza with a photograph of the target, a key to the target's home, and a .45 caliber pistol, all delivered inside a brown paper bag. What Morgan did not know was that Mendoza had already turned. He was working with law enforcement. Mendoza testified against Morgan in court. The evidence was overwhelming. In 1978, Joe Morgan was sentenced to life in prison. The state of California believed that a life sentence would end his influence. It did not. Morgan continued to operate from inside the prison system through the late 1970s and through the 1980s. His reach, according to investigators, did not diminish. The Mexican Mafia's drug distribution networks continued to expand. The organization's presence on the streets of California continued to grow. LAIM collected taxes from street gang members across Los Angeles. Drug dealers paid tribute. Violence was ordered and carried out. And much of that direction flowed, according to federal investigators and court testimony, from Morgan and the network of LAIM members who remained loyal to him inside and outside the walls. In December of 1989, California opened Pelican Bay State Prison. The facility had been designed specifically to address the problem Morgan represented. Its security housing unit, the SHU, was built to isolate the most dangerous and influential gang leaders in the California system. 22.5 hours per day in a concrete cell. No congregate activities. No contact with other inmates. Severely restricted communication with the outside world. Morgan was transferred to Pelican Bay. And according to documented accounts, he continued to manage the Mexican Mafia from inside the SHU. 22.5 hours a day in a concrete box. No direct contact with associates. No phone calls to drug dealers on the outside. No meetings, no handshakes, no visible chain of command. And still, according to investigators, the organization moved on his direction. The exact mechanisms by which Morgan maintained that influence inside the SHU remain, in some respects, a subject of ongoing documentation. What is established is the pattern. Court cases emerging from the period of Morgan's confinement at Pelican Bay consistently identified LAIM's organizational activity continuing without interruption. The machine that Morgan had spent decades building had become something that could operate even when its architect was sealed inside a concrete room at the edge of the California coast. In 1992, a film called American Me was released. Directed by and starring Edward James Olmos, it was a fictionalized account of the Mexican Mafia's history. One of its central supporting characters, a non-Mexican member with an artificial leg, was clearly modeled on Joe Morgan. Morgan refused to speak with Olmos when the director sought his approval. He filed a lawsuit against Olmos and Universal Studios, claiming the film used his likeness and story without permission. The lawsuit sought $500,000. It was ultimately dismissed. But according to multiple documented accounts, Olmos was subsequently placed on the Mexican Mafia's Greenlight list, meaning he had been marked for death. Some accounts suggest Olmos made a payment to LAIM to have the Greenlight removed. Olmos has never publicly confirmed this. Two people connected to the film's production, former Mexican Mafia members and affiliates who had served as advisors, were reportedly killed in connection with LAIM's displeasure over the script. Morgan never saw the resolution of any of it. In October 1993, he became ill inside Pelican Bay. On October 4th, he was transferred to the hospital ward at California State Prison, Corcoran. On October 27th, he was diagnosed with inoperable liver cancer. His wife requested compassionate release. She asked that her husband be allowed to leave prison to die at home. The process moved slowly. Joe Pegleg Morgan died on November 9, 1993, inside Corcoran's hospital ward, before the compassionate release was completed. He was 64 years old. He had spent more years of his life inside California's prison system than outside it. He had arrived at San Quentin as a 17-year-old convicted of murder and left the system in a body bag, having built one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the history of the United States, not despite being incarcerated, but in significant part through it. His attorney, Shirley McDonald, told reporters afterward, "When I visited him about 6 months ago, he appeared to be losing some weight and his color didn't look good, but Joe is a very private person and he didn't complain." Joe Morgan did not complain. He also did not stop. He ran LAIM from a cell for nearly 30 years. He built alliances across racial lines at a time when that was considered impossible inside the California prison system. He connected a street-level prison gang to international drug supply chains in Mexico. He brokered peace agreements with organizations that should have been enemies. He directed murders from behind concrete walls. He filed lawsuits from inside the SHU. He died in a prison hospital with a life sentence hanging over him, a sentence that, in the end, the cancer got to before the state ever truly did. What comes next in this documentary is a man who arrived at Pelican Bay not as a godfather, but as a soldier who clawed his way upward through one of the most violent organizations in California's criminal history, and who would ultimately make a choice that shook LAIM to its foundation. His name is Rene Enriquez. And his story begins not in a courtroom, but in the streets of South Central Los Angeles, where a young man with everything to prove was about to prove it in the worst possible way. He wanted Laim to operate as a transnational organized crime syndicate from inside a prison cell. In 1971, according to documented records, the Mexican Mafia carried out the first prison gang street execution in the history of Los Angeles. The killing was organized and directed from inside the prison system. Morgan's fingerprints, not literally, but strategically, were on the evolution of Laim's reach from inside the walls to the streets outside. The California prison system could not contain what Morgan was building. But it kept trying. In 1977, Morgan's life sentence became inevitable. According to court records, Morgan sought to arrange the murder of a drug dealer in Seal Beach, California. The dealer had failed to pay money owed to the Mexican Mafia. Morgan, seeking to enforce the organization's financial interests, turned to a fellow Laim member named Ramon Mundo Mendoza to carry out the killing. He supplied Mendoza with a photograph of the target, a key to the target's home, and a .45 caliber pistol, all delivered inside a brown paper bag. What Morgan did not know was that Mendoza had already turned. He was working with law enforcement. Mendoza testified against Morgan in court. The evidence was overwhelming. In 1978, Joe Morgan was sentenced to life in prison. The state of California believed that a life sentence would end his influence. It did not. Morgan continued to operate from inside the prison system through the late 1970s and through the 1980s. His reach, according to investigators, did not diminish. The Mexican Mafia's drug distribution networks continued to expand. The organization's presence on the streets of California continued to grow. Laim collected taxes from street gang members across Los Angeles. Drug dealers paid tribute. Violence was ordered and carried out. And much of that direction flowed, according to federal investigators and court testimony, from Morgan and the network of Laim members who remained loyal to him inside and outside the walls. In December of 1989, California opened Pelican Bay State Prison. The facility had been designed specifically to address the problem Morgan represented. Its security housing unit, the SHU, was built to isolate the most dangerous and influential gang leaders in the California system. 22.5 hours per day in a concrete cell. No congregate activities. No contact with other inmates. Severely restricted communication with the outside world. Morgan was transferred to Pelican Bay. And according to documented accounts, he continued to manage the Mexican Mafia from inside the SHU. 22.5 hours a day in a concrete box. No direct contact with associates. No phone calls to drug dealers on the outside. No meetings, no handshakes, no visible chain of command. And still, according to investigators, the organization moved on his direction. The exact mechanisms by which Morgan maintained that influence inside the SHU remain, in some respects, a subject of ongoing documentation. What is established is the pattern. Court cases emerging from the period of Morgan's confinement at Pelican Bay consistently identified Laim's organizational activity continuing without interruption. The machine that Morgan had spent decades building had become something that could operate even when its architect was sealed inside a concrete room at the edge of the California coast. In 1992, a film called American Me was released. Directed by and starring Edward James Olmos, it was a fictionalized account of the Mexican Mafia's history. One of its central supporting characters, a non-Mexican member with an artificial leg, was clearly modeled on Joe Morgan. Morgan refused to speak with Olmos when the director sought his approval. He filed a lawsuit against Olmos and Universal Studios, claiming the film used his likeness and story without permission. The lawsuit sought $500,000. It was ultimately dismissed. But according to multiple documented accounts, Olmos was subsequently placed on the Mexican Mafia's Greenlight list, meaning he had been marked for death. Some accounts suggest Olmos made a payment to Laim to have the Greenlight removed. Olmos has never publicly confirmed this. Two people connected to the film's production, former Mexican Mafia members and affiliates who had served as advisors, were reportedly killed in connection with Laim's displeasure over the script. Morgan never saw the resolution of any of it. In October 1993, he became ill inside Pelican Bay. On October 4th, he was transferred to the hospital ward at California State Prison, Corcoran. On October 27th, he was diagnosed with inoperable liver cancer. His wife requested compassionate release. She asked that her husband be allowed to leave prison to die at home. The process moved slowly. Joe Pegleg Morgan died on November 9, 1993, inside Corcoran's hospital ward, before the compassionate release was completed. He was 64 years old. He had spent more years of his life inside California's prison system than outside it. He had arrived at San Quentin as a 17-year-old convicted of murder and left the system in a body bag, having built one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the history of the United States, not despite being incarcerated, but in significant part through it. His attorney, Shirley McDonald, told reporters afterward, "When I visited him about 6 months ago, he appeared to be losing some weight and his color didn't look good, but Joe is a very private person and he didn't complain." Joe Morgan did not complain. He also did not stop. He ran Laim from a cell for nearly 30 years. He built alliances across racial lines at a time when that was considered impossible inside the California prison system. He connected a street-level prison gang to international drug supply chains in Mexico. He brokered peace agreements with organizations that should have been enemies. He directed murders from behind concrete walls. He filed lawsuits from inside the SHU. He died in a prison hospital with a life sentence hanging over him, a sentence that, in the end, the cancer got to before the state ever truly did. What comes next in this documentary is a man who arrived at Pelican Bay not as a godfather, but as a soldier who clawed his way upward through one of the most violent organizations in California's criminal history, and who would ultimately make a choice that shook Lerma to its foundation. His name is Rene Enriquez. And his story begins not in a courtroom, but in the streets of South Central Los Angeles, where a young man with everything to prove was about to prove it in the worst possible way. Joe Morgan built the machine. Rene Enriquez was exactly the kind of man that machine was designed to produce. Where Morgan arrived at his criminal life through poverty, immigration, and the raw street survival of a Croatian kid in a Mexican neighborhood, Enriquez had no such excuse. And he would be the first to tell you that. Rene Enriquez was born on July 7, 1962, in Artesia, California. His parents were immigrants from Mexico. They had built something in America. Something modest, but real. A middle-class home in Cerritos, California. A family business. A life that most people who crossed that border dreamed about and never achieved. Enriquez threw it away before he was old enough to drive. He showed promise in school. Teachers noticed it. His father noticed it and tried to channel it into the family business. But Rene was not interested in the family business. He was interested in the streets of Artesia, a few miles from where he lived, where his older brother Mark had already carved out a reputation. Mark was a member of Artesia 13, one of the local street gangs that controlled the neighborhood's criminal activity. Mark gave Rene a nickname early. He called him Boxer. And according to documented accounts, Mark used his younger brother to break into neighbors' homes. He taught him what he knew. He handed him a life. By the age of 12, Rene Enriquez had been formally jumped into Artesia 13, initiated through a beating administered by the gang's own members. By 13, he was smoking marijuana. Within a year, he was using and dealing PCP and LSD. He had already been in contact with law enforcement multiple times for property damage. In 2015, testifying in court, Enriquez described his initiation. According to his testimony, members of the gang dragged him behind a gas station and beat him. That was the door. He walked through it and never looked back. By his late teens, he had committed a string of armed robberies across the area. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. He was 19 years old when he arrived at the Dual Vocational Institution in Tracy, California, the same facility where the Mexican Mafia had been born more than 2 decades earlier. It was at Dual that Enriquez first encountered Lerma. And Lerma encountered him. What the Mexican Mafia saw in Rene Enriquez, according to multiple documented accounts, was a young man with something rare and dangerous. He was fearless. Not reckless, fearless. There is a difference. Reckless men panic. They make mistakes. They become liabilities. Fearless men calculate. They commit. They follow through regardless of consequence. The Mexican Mafia had built its entire organizational structure on the willingness to commit violence without hesitation. Enriquez had that willingness in abundance. He was recruited. And he proved himself almost immediately. While imprisoned at Dual, according to documented accounts, Enriquez acted as a hitman for Lerma. He stabbed a gang member from Los Angeles. The man survived. He was then ordered to kill again. This time the target was a member of the Vegas Motorcycle Club, a man known inside the facility by the nickname Chainsaw. Enriquez killed him. He was not yet 25 years old. In 1985, Rene Enriquez was formally inducted into the Mexican Mafia as a full carnal, the Spanish word for brother, the title given to fully made members of Lerma. He was 23 years old. In an organization where full membership was earned through documented violence and years of demonstrated loyalty, becoming a carnal at 23 was exceptional. It marked Enriquez as someone the organization intended to use for bigger things. He would later describe his mindset at that time with a clarity that is difficult to dismiss. According to documented testimony, he said, "I believe I'm a cut above the rest. As a mafioso, you have to be an elitist. You have an elitist, arrogant mentality. That's how you carry yourself in the Mexican Mafia. That's how you project yourself." That mentality drove him upward through Lerma's ranks through the mid to late 1980s. He became an enforcer, then an organizer, then a figure with genuine authority within the structure that Morgan and others had built. He helped project the Mexican Mafia into a level of organizational sophistication it had not previously achieved, coordinating a network that, according to federal documentation, encompassed approximately 60,000 heavily armed gang members across California's street gangs and prison system. In 1989, Enriquez was released on parole. He lasted 2 years. On the outside, Enriquez did what Lerma expected of its street-level representatives. He collected street tax, the tribute that drug dealers, criminals, and gang members in Mexican Mafia territory were required to pay to Lerma in exchange for the right to operate. He enforced payment. And when payment was not forthcoming, or when loyalty was called into question, he acted. According to court records and his own subsequent testimony, Enriquez ordered the killing of Cynthia Gavaldan, a drug dealer operating in territory under his supervision who he believed was withholding street tax proceeds from Lerma. Gavaldan was killed. He also killed a fellow Cano. A man named David Gallegos had fallen out of favor with the organization. According to Enriquez's own testimony, Gallegos had run from a gunfight, which in Lerma's code was an unforgivable act of cowardice. Enriquez administered a fatal heroin overdose to Gallegos. And then, to be certain, he shot him 5 times in the head. These were not crimes of passion. They were organizational executions, carried out with the cold precision of a man who had been trained to treat violence as administration. In 1991, while Enriquez was navigating the politics of Lerma's leadership structure, a dispute erupted involving Salvador Mon Buenrostro, a senior Mexican Mafia figure. According to court records, Enriquez and an associate confronted Buenrostro in a lawyer's interview room inside the Los Angeles County Jail. They stabbed him approximately 30 times. Buenrostro survived. Enriquez was arrested, charged, and tried for the murders of Cynthia Gavaldan and David Gallegos. In 1991, he was convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life in California State Prison. In 1993, the California Department of Corrections made its determination about where Rene Enriquez would serve that sentence. They sent him to Pelican Bay. According to documented accounts, Enriquez later described the moment of arrival with striking specificity. He stepped off the prison transport bus and the smell hit him first: pine trees, redwood forest, the loamy coastal air of the Northern California coast. And then he stepped inside the security housing unit and everything changed. He described it this way: the smell inside the SHU hit him like a wave. He called it the smell of despair, depression, and desperation. He said it was a place where people come to die. He spent 10 years inside that unit. 23 hours per day in a windowless concrete cell. A small cage outside for exercise during the remaining hour. No congregate activities. No programs. No visible connection to the world beyond the walls. According to a prison gang investigator who spent years monitoring Enriquez's activities, the man who arrived at Pelican Bay did not slow down. He found ways. He adapted. His exploits inside the SHU became, according to that investigator, the stuff of legend among both inmates and corrections staff. A journalist who visited Pelican Bay State Prison described the moment he came face to face with Michael Lerma through a sheet of plexiglass inside the security housing unit. He described a small man, bent, wearied by years of solitary confinement, cooking a cup of cocoa on a hot plate inside a pale yellow concrete cell where he spent 23 hours of every single day. He looked, according to that account, like a man the world had forgotten. According to federal prosecutors, he was running an empire. Michael Lerma was born in 1956 in Pomona, California. By the time he arrived in the world, Pomona had already begun its long decline from the citrus belt paradise it had once been. The lemon and orange groves were gone. The millionaires had moved on. What remained was a working-class city on the eastern edge of Los Angeles County, filling up with families who had come looking for something better and found something harder. Lerma's father was a heroin dealer. He abandoned the family before Michael was old enough to understand what that abandonment meant. His mother and grandmother raised him and his 6 siblings in a Pomona that was increasingly being carved up by street gangs with names like Pomona Sir, Happytown, Ghetto Family, Cherryville, and 12th Street. Lerma joined 12th Street, his neighborhood's gang, the Sharkies, when he was 12 years old. He was not yet a teenager. Before he finished high school, Lerma had already been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. He was released after 3 days without being charged. And then, in a turn that speaks to the genuine complexity of his early life, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. At his 2009 parole hearing, Lerma described that year in the Marines with a clarity that is difficult to dismiss. He told the board it was probably the best year of his life. He learned discipline. He learned about chain of command. He foresaw, he said, a promising career. He did not stay. He returned to Pomona and to 12th Street. And in 1982, according to court records, Michael Lerma shot a man to death in Sacramento County. The victim had robbed Lerma of heroin and a power tool. Lerma found him and killed him. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in California State Prison. He was in his mid-20s. He would not walk the streets of Pomona again. What happened to Michael Lerma inside California's prison system over the following decades is a story that operates on 2 levels simultaneously. On one level, it is the story of a man who spent more than 4 decades incarcerated, most of it in solitary confinement, officially denied and officially managed and officially contained. On another level, it is the story of a criminal organization finding ways to use that containment as a kind of cover, to operate through intermediaries, to through coded communication, through a network of associates who moved freely in the world outside those walls while Lerma directed from within. According to prison classification records, Lerma became a formally documented member of the Mexican Mafia in 1995. He denied it at every parole hearing. He told the board repeatedly that he had never been a member of any prison gang and had never been involved in any prison gang activity. The federal indictment handed down against him in 2018 told a different story entirely. According to that indictment, drawn from years of FBI investigation by the San Gabriel Valley Safe Streets Task Force, Lerma had controlled Latino street gangs in and around Pomona for years, directing their criminal activity, taxing their drug proceeds, ordering violence against those who failed to comply, all from inside a concrete cell at Pelican Bay where he spent 23 hours of every day. The mechanism by which he did this is documented in court records and is worth understanding in detail, because it reveals something important about how the security housing unit's isolation protocols, as rigorous as they were, still contained a vulnerability that the Mexican Mafia had learned to exploit systematically. The key was the Señora. In La IM's organizational structure, a Señora is a high-level female associate who serves as the incarcerated member's voice and hands on the outside world. She collects tax from drug dealers. She distributes proceeds. She relays orders. She manages the day-to-day criminal administration of the incarcerated member's territory. She is, in every functional sense, the outside CEO of an enterprise whose chairman is locked in a box. Lerma's primary Señora was a woman named Cheryl Perez Castaneda, 62 years old at the time of her eventual conviction. According to court records, from February 2012 to July 2016, Perez Castaneda collected extortionate taxes from Pomona drug dealers, distributed the proceeds to La IM including to Lerma's prison account, and gave orders to others on behalf of Lerma's enterprise. She was, according to prosecutors, his mouthpiece, his enforcer, his administrator. But Perez Castaneda was not simply a loyal operative following instructions. According to documented court records, she also used her position to pursue her own agenda. In July 2013, she solicited the murder of a Los Angeles County Jail inmate in retaliation for the shooting of her own son. When she was informed the victim had been stabbed but not killed, she sought and obtained approval from a Mexican Mafia member to have the victim placed on a Greenlight list. She was eventually convicted and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Lerma also maintained a secretary, a 43-year-old woman from La Verne who facilitated a 2013 armed robbery and was involved in extortion and narcotics distribution. She was convicted and sentenced to more than 7 years in federal prison. The enterprise extended well beyond Pomona. According to federal prosecutors, Lerma controlled and extorted drug proceeds not only from street gangs in and around Pomona, but also from incarcerated Latinos inside Calipatria State Prison in Imperial County, a facility hundreds of miles from Pelican Bay. His reach, according to the federal case, crossed institutional boundaries as easily as it crossed geographical ones. The criminal activity documented in the indictment included robberies, kidnapping, identity theft, fraud, drug trafficking, and murder. In one documented incident, members of Lerma's enterprise attempted to steal a Mercedes-Benz automobile owned by a Los Angeles County Jail inmate. When the caretaker of the vehicle refused to hand it over, one of the defendants shot him. In another documented incident, a woman was kidnapped by members of Lerma's organization, held for several days while being extorted for money, and was on the verge of being murdered when law enforcement disrupted the plot. All of this, according to federal prosecutors, was occurring while the man directing it was cooking cocoa on a hot plate in a pale yellow concrete cell at the edge of the California coast. In 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Lerma and 12 other defendants on multiple felonies including racketeering conspiracy, violent crimes in aid of racketeering, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and firearms offenses. Lerma was transferred out of Pelican Bay and into federal custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles. It was a transfer that should have ended his ability to direct criminal operations. It did not. According to court records and evidence presented at trial, once Lerma arrived at the Metropolitan Detention Center, he extended his organizational reach into the federal facility itself. He took over his wing of the MDC. He oversaw drug sales inside the federal jail. He directed stabbings. And in June 2020, according to prosecutors, he ordered the murder of a fellow federal inmate identified in court documents only as SB. SB had failed to pay drug debts owed to Lerma's cell of the Mexican Mafia. That debt cost him his life. 3 inmates carried out the killing inside the Metropolitan Detention Center on Lerma's direct order. This is the detail that federal prosecutors returned to again and again during the 20-day trial that followed. A man who had been in solitary confinement for 26 years. A man who had been transferred to federal custody specifically to disrupt his criminal operations. And within a defined period of being inside a new facility, he had, according to prosecutors, already identified the power structure, established his position within it, initiated drug distribution, and ordered an execution. The jury deliberated and returned its verdict. Guilty. On all major counts. Racketeering conspiracy. violent crimes in aid of racketeering, first-degree murder, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, methamphetamine and heroin, at the MDC and in the Pomona area. The acting United States Attorney Joseph McNally said after the verdict, "These defendants were key players in a criminal enterprise that committed murder, assault, and drug trafficking." The FBI's Akil Davis was more direct about what the case revealed. According to his statement, the case made clear that gang violence by Mexican Mafia members and associates had been directed not only from the streets, but from prisons in California. 16 total convictions were secured in the broader case. Michael Lerma, as of the time of this documentary, is serving a mandatory sentence of life in federal prison. He is 68 years old. He has been incarcerated since 1982. He has never, in all of those decades, stopped operating. The Pomona police chief who oversaw the investigation said something after the indictment that is worth considering. He said the Pomona community had certainly suffered from the criminal acts of those indicted. One journalist who covered the case described Lerma as a mythical figure in Pomona. A man nobody had seen on the street since the 1980s, whose name still moved through the city like weather. Whose words still carried weight in places he had never physically been. There is something in that description that gets to the heart of what Michael Lerma represents in the history of organized crime inside California's prison system. He was not powerful because of what he could do with his hands. He was powerful because of what he could make other people do with theirs. From a concrete box. Through a plexiglass wall. 23 hours a day. The system built to contain him became the foundation of his authority. Now here is what most people watching this documentary do not know. The case of Michael Lerma is not an anomaly. It is not an exceptional story of one unusually resourceful man finding an unprecedented way around the system. The evidence accumulated across the federal prosecutions of Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia leadership over more than 3 decades consistently reveals the same pattern. The SHU did not eliminate criminal command structures inside California's prison system. It concentrated them. It removed the noise and the distraction of general population prison life and left, in each cell, a man with nothing to do but think. Nothing to focus on but the organization. Nothing to consider but the network, the territory, the money, and the people who owed loyalty. A 2011 class action lawsuit, Ashka versus Governor of California, brought by SHU inmates documented what years of solitary confinement did to the human beings inside those cells. The suit described severe psychological deterioration, sensory deprivation, and conditions that a federal judge eventually found unconstitutional. In 2015, California reached a landmark settlement in that case, agreeing to dramatically reform its use of long-term solitary confinement and to transfer most SHU inmates into general population. The men who remained in command of criminal networks from inside those cells would tell you the system never understood what it had built. Isolation gave them something that general population could never provide. Total focus. Absolute authority. And an organization that continued to run itself outside the walls whether the man inside was watching or not. Because the machine, by that point, had been running long enough that it no longer needed its operators to be free. It only needed them to be alive. In the mountains of Northern California, a different organization had learned the same lesson. But where the Mexican Mafia had built its empire through decades of organic growth, this organization had done something more deliberate. More structured. More explicitly modeled on the idea of corporate criminal governance. Its name was Nuestra Familia. And it had placed its entire command structure inside a single facility. Inside Pelican Bay. At the top of that structure sat a man the federal government would spend years trying to reach. A man who, according to court testimony, ordered dozens of murders from behind those walls. A man whose organization ran drug networks across Northern California like a business with territories, managers, and quarterly expectations. His name was Gerald Rubalcaba. And what Operation Black Widow uncovered about what was coming out of his cell is a story that begins not in a courtroom, but in the fields and canneries of the Central Valley, where a young man from a farm worker family was building towards something that would eventually require the combined resources of state and federal law enforcement to dismantle. That was the story of Michael Lerma. But inside those same walls, a completely different criminal empire was assembling itself. Not built around the Mexican Mafia. Not built around the loyalties of Southern California streets. Built instead around something older, something born from the fields and canneries of Northern California, something rooted in a war that began with a stolen pair of shoes and never truly ended. Its name was Nuestra Familia. And to understand Gerald Rubalcaba, you first have to understand the organization he came to lead. Because without that context, the scale of what federal investigators uncovered inside Pelican Bay makes no sense at all. In the mid-1960s, the California prison system was already divided along racial lines. Black inmates. White inmates. Southern California's Mexican-American inmates, organized under the Mexican Mafia. And then there were the men from the north. Mexican-American farm workers and their children, men who had grown up in the fields and canneries of the Central Valley, in the towns around Salinas and Fresno and Stockton. They were different from the Los Angeles Chicanos who ran La Im. and the Mexican Mafia treated them accordingly. According to documented historical accounts, LAIM members inside California's prisons abused and extorted the Northern California inmates systematically. They taxed them. They stole from them. And in 1965, at the Correctional Training Facility in Soledad, California, the Northerners began to organize. What started as a protective alliance became something else entirely. The spark that converted a loose protective grouping into a full criminal organization came, according to documented accounts, from a dispute that seems almost absurdly small given the decades of bloodshed it would generate. A Mexican Mafia member stole the shoes of a Northern California inmate. The Northern inmate confronted the thief. He was stabbed to death. And what followed became known as the War of the Shoes, the ignition point of the longest-running gang war in the history of the state of California. Nuestra Familia, our family, was the result. From the beginning, Nuestra Familia operated differently from LAIM. Where the Mexican Mafia was organized through personal loyalty and individual relationships, Nuestra Familia built something more structural. A written constitution. Formal military-style rank. Generals at the top. Captains below them. Regiments of foot soldiers organized by geography. A formal hierarchy that specified how orders would flow, how money would be collected, how discipline would be enforced, and how traitors would be handled. The Constitution stated one thing with particular clarity. The leadership of Nuestra Familia would reside at Pelican Bay State Prison. Not as a matter of circumstance. As organizational doctrine. The SHU at Pelican Bay was written into the gang's founding document as the seat of its government. And it was from that seat of government that Gerald Rubalcaba ruled. Gerald Rubalcaba was born in Tulare County, California, the heart of the Central Valley's agricultural corridor, where the fields stretched to the horizon and the work was brutal and the pay was minimal and the towns in between were places people left as soon as they could. His path into Nuestra Familia followed the route that the organization's own history had carved out. Northern California. Mexican-American. The prison system as the gateway into the organization's upper ranks. The details of Rubalcaba's early life and his precise path to Pelican Bay are less extensively documented in public records than his organizational role inside the facility. What is thoroughly documented, through federal court records, investigative reporting, and testimony in the Operation Black Widow prosecution, is what he did from inside that cell. He rose to become what court records describe as the most powerful Nuestro general in Nuestra Familia's command structure. The organization's written constitution designated its top military leaders as Nuestro generals, La Mesa, the table, and Rubalcaba occupied one of those positions with an authority that, according to federal investigators, was absolute within the organization's Northern California networks. According to court records, he carried the organization's constitution inside his body when moving between locations within the facility. He kept the master hit list, a document containing the names of individuals the organization had sanctioned for execution, with him at all times. By the time Operation Black Widow's federal investigation documented that list, according to court records and investigative reporting, it contained 50 names. He ordered murders from inside that cell with a regularity that federal prosecutors described as systematic. According to court papers filed by prosecutors in the Operation Black Widow case, Rubalcaba was accused of ordering dozens of murders while imprisoned at Pelican Bay. The targets included rival gang members, Nuestra Familia members who had fallen out of favor, drug dealers who had failed to pay tribute, and, in a particularly audacious escalation that law enforcement officials described as unlike anything they had previously encountered, 2 assistant district attorneys in Santa Clara County. That last detail deserves to stop and be considered fully. Inside a maximum security prison cell. In the security housing unit. 22.5 hours a day in isolation. Gerald Rubalcaba ordered the assassination of 2 sitting prosecutors. Not street-level rivals. Not competing drug dealers. Assistant district attorneys of Santa Clara County. Public officials of the state of California. According to documented accounts from the Operation Black Widow investigation, Henry Happy Cervantes, a senior Nuestra Familia captain, was recorded on an FBI wire discussing a plan to kill those 2 district attorneys. Caspa, a cooperating witness who had been placed inside Nuestra Familia's operations by federal investigators, refused to allow the order to proceed. He saved their lives. And the recording of Cervantes discussing that plan became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence assembled during the entire investigation. Rubalcaba's reach extended well beyond murder orders. According to the East Bay Express's detailed investigative reporting on Operation Black Widow, Rubalcaba was directing financial operations from inside Pelican Bay as well. In 1998, he funded a rap music label, North Star Records, from his prison account. The label was established by a Nuestra Familia captain named Robert Huerito Grattan, who had paroled from Pelican Bay and moved to Modesto. The plan, according to federal prosecutors, was to use the label to produce a rap album that would serve simultaneously as a recruitment tool for Nuestra Familia and as a money laundering vehicle for the gang's drug proceeds. The album would preach the unification of Nortinos across Northern California. And it would be funded, according to prosecutors, by a man sitting in a concrete box at the edge of the California coast. Rubalcaba also ordered the internal disciplinary killing of Robert Brown Bob Viramontes, a 20-year Nuestra Familia veteran and member of the organization's leading council, in early 1998. According to documented accounts, Viramontes had become a perceived liability. He was killed outside his Campbell, California home. The internal politics of Nuestra Familia during this period were, according to court testimony, simultaneously ruthless and bureaucratic. Disagreements were adjudicated through organizational procedure, and then enforced through violence. Rubalcaba accused a fellow senior member of embezzling gang funds. That accusation triggered a murder order. The target sought protection from another Nuestra Familia general. The general interceded. The murder order was temporarily suspended. And then, shortly afterward, the target, a man identified in court records as Casper, contacted federal authorities and offered to cooperate. Casper became the central informant in Operation Black Widow. Over the following months, according to documented accounts, Casper hosted a series of meetings with senior Nuestra Familia leadership in the Tracy, California area. Those meetings were monitored by the FBI. The intelligence gathered from those monitored meetings, combined with years of wire intercepts, surveillance, and documentary evidence accumulated during the 3-year federal investigation, gave prosecutors a comprehensive map of Nuestra Familia's command structure, with Gerald Rubalcaba at its apex. In June 2001, Operation Black Widow concluded. 21 Nuestra Familia leaders and senior members were arrested. The scale of violence attributed to those defendants was staggering. According to investigative reporting at the time, the case documented 15 killings, 80 conspiracies to murder, 10 attempted murders, 10 felony assaults, 100 assaults, and 2 drive-by shootings, all directed or carried out by the men sitting in that courtroom and their associates on the outside. The 5 highest-ranking generals, Rubalcaba, James Tibbs Moado, Joseph Pinky Hernandez, Cornelio Tristan, and Tex Marin Hernandez, faced the most serious charges. Rubalcaba was convicted and sentenced. And then the federal government did something that no California law enforcement effort had previously managed to accomplish. They removed him from Pelican Bay entirely. In the aftermath of Operation Black Widow, the 5 generals were transferred to the United States Penitentiary Florence ADX in Florence, Colorado. The federal Supermax prison. The facility sometimes called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The most restrictive federal correctional facility in the United States. The transfer created an immediate crisis inside Nuestra Familia's organizational structure. Because the organization's own written constitution specified that its leadership resided at Pelican Bay. The constitution did not contemplate a scenario in which all 5 of its generals were simultaneously removed and transferred to a facility in another state. The result, according to documented reports from law enforcement and corrections officials, was organizational chaos. A power vacuum that triggered a leadership struggle among the captains and regiment commanders who remained at Pelican Bay. Factions formed. Loyalties split. Some members remained loyal to the 5 generals in Colorado. Others refused to accept out-of-state authority. Former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, reviewing the situation, publicly complained that concentrating all 5 former leaders in the same federal supermax was itself a mistake, that by keeping them together, the federal government had allowed them to continue exercising organizational influence from inside ADX Florence. He argued they should be scattered across different facilities to prevent any residual command structure from forming. His complaint was not acted upon. Gerald Rubalcaba remains imprisoned at the federal level as of the time of this documentary. He is serving a sentence that reflects the full weight of the federal racketeering prosecution. He is housed at a facility specifically designed to prevent the kind of external organizational direction that defined his years at Pelican Bay. Whether that containment is absolute is a question that, given everything documented about the men in this documentary, deserves to be asked. Now the second story of Chapter 4. His name was James Moado. And his road to the top of Nuestra Familia's command structure ran through the same Central Valley corridors as Rubalcaba's, but the story of what happened to his family while he was imprisoned added a dimension to the case that went beyond organized crime and into something more intimate and more brutal. James Tibbs Moado was from Hanford, California. Kings County. Another Central Valley town in the agricultural flatlands southeast of Fresno. Moado's documented biography places him in the Nuestra Familia's organizational structure at the general level, one of the 5 Nuestro generals who constituted La Mesa, the ruling council of the organization, operating from inside Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit. The specific details of Moado's early life and his path to Nuestra Familia's highest ranks are not as extensively documented in public records as his organizational position. What is established through court records and investigative reporting is his standing within the organization and his role in the criminal enterprise documented in Operation Black Widow. According to federal court records, Moado was identified as one of the 5 highest-ranking generals in Nuestra Familia's leadership structure. He was confined at Pelican Bay and participated in the organizational direction of criminal activity across Northern California, drug trafficking, extortion, and murder, in the same manner and through the same mechanisms as Rubalcaba and the other generals. He was indicted as part of Operation Black Widow. In the period between his indictment and his eventual guilty plea, Moato was held at a special Alameda County jail facility. It was during this period that he became associated with a 20-year-old Salinas woman named Crystal Nenk. According to documented accounts, Crystal took the Moato name and was considered, in the manner common within gang culture, his common-law wife. James Moato pleaded guilty to federal racketeering conspiracy charges involving 2 murders and drug trafficking. He received a life sentence, added to the life sentence he was already serving at Pelican Bay. He was transferred to federal custody and, along with the other 4 generals, was eventually sent to ADX Florence in Colorado. On January 31, 2005, a commercial trucker driving on Hecker Pass Highway near Gilroy noticed the car stopped on the side of the road with its lights on and its engine running. He passed it on his outbound journey. An hour later, returning on the same route, he noticed the car was still there. He stopped. He approached the vehicle. He saw blood. He drove to where he had cell phone reception and called 911. Crystal Nenk Moato, 20 years old, was found slumped over in the driver's seat. She had been shot. Paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. Her death, according to law enforcement officials who investigated it, was almost certainly connected to the reorganization and power struggle that had erupted within Nuestra Familia following the Operation Black Widow prosecutions and the transfer of the 5 generals to Colorado. The killing of a general's wife in the immediate aftermath of his conviction and removal from the organization's power structure is not, in the documented history of these organizations, a coincidence. Investigators contacted James Moato in federal custody regarding the murder of his common-law wife. According to documented accounts, he refused to speak with them. Crystal Nenk Moato's killer has never been publicly identified. Her case remains, as of the time of this documentary, unresolved. She was 20 years old. She attended a church in Salinas where she had been baptized as a child. Her pastor, who presided over her funeral at the Garden of Memories in Salinas, described her loss as tragic. A commercial trucker found her on a highway at noon with her car still running. And the man she had connected her life to was already unreachable behind the walls of a federal supermax prison in Colorado, where he had been sent specifically because the organization he ran had done too much damage to be allowed to remain in California. James Tibbs Moato remains incarcerated at the federal level, serving a life sentence. He is in his early 70s. He has spent virtually the entirety of his adult life inside California's and then the federal government's most restrictive correctional environments. The organization he commanded from inside Pelican Bay's SHU continues to exist, reorganized under new leadership, its written constitution updated to address the absence of the 5 generals removed after Operation Black Widow. The 5 men who sat at La Mesa inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit and directed criminal operations across Northern California have been removed from that facility permanently. But the organization they built has not stopped. The streets they taxed are still being taxed. The drug networks they commanded have reorganized under new management. And the written constitution they governed by, updated, revised, passed from hand to hand through the same channels of concealment that carried their murder orders, continues to guide thousands of Nortino gang members across the state. The generals are gone. The family remains. What came next inside Pelican Bay was a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped a man whose rise to the top of Nuestra Familia's command structure was not planned, not anticipated, and not fully understood by law enforcement until it had already happened. His name was David Cervantes. And the story of how he became the single most powerful Nortino leader in California, while confined inside the same walls where the 5 generals had just been removed, is a story about what happens when you take the head off an organization and the body refuses to die. If you have stayed with this documentary to this point, subscribe now. Every story that follows deserves to be heard. The generals were gone. 5 men removed from Pelican Bay in a single coordinated operation. Transferred to a federal supermax prison in Colorado. Stripped of their California sentences through an arrangement so legally unusual that it required the approval of the California Supreme Court and the signature of a sitting governor to execute. An entire command structure dismantled in the space of a single federal prosecution. And yet, the organization's written constitution stated clearly that its leadership resided at Pelican Bay State Prison. Not ADX Florence. Not any federal facility in Colorado. Pelican Bay. The document the gang's founders had written decades earlier had embedded the seat of power into a specific physical location. A specific building. A specific set of concrete cells on the Northern California coast. When the 5 generals were removed from those cells, what followed was not silence. What followed was a war. Inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit, the captains and regiment commanders who remained began maneuvering for position. The organization that had been governed by 5 generals simultaneously was now leaderless by its own constitutional definition. Factions formed along lines of personal loyalty. Some members deferred to the exiled generals in Colorado, continuing to take their direction from a facility in another state. Others refused. The written constitution said the leaders lived at Pelican Bay. The leaders were not at Pelican Bay. The constitution's own logic had fractured the organization's command structure. According to documented law enforcement accounts, the power struggle that erupted inside Nuestra Familia in the immediate aftermath of Operation Black Widow played out on the streets of Northern California in blood. Shootings in Salinas increased by documented percentages as Nortino factions aligned with different claimants to the organizational throne. Drive-by shootings. Targeted executions. Violence that law enforcement officials attributed directly to the internal chaos of an organization whose leadership had just been decapitated. 3 new generals eventually emerged inside Pelican Bay's SHU. Their names were David Cervantes, Jose Gonzalez, and James Perez. And then, in what court documents and law enforcement officials described as a coup, an internal organizational seizure of power conducted through the gang's own procedural mechanisms, Gonzalez and Perez were demoted. Not removed. Not killed. Demoted. Stripped of their rank and reduced to Category 1, the lowest membership tier in Nuestra Familia's hierarchy. Exactly how that demotion was engineered, and exactly what Cervantes' role in engineering it was, is not fully detailed in public court records. What is documented is the result. David Cervantes stood alone. According to law enforcement officials who monitored Nuestra Familia's activities through the mid-2000s, Cervantes' rise marked something historically unprecedented within the organization. For the first time in decades, a single man sat alone at the helm of the entire Nuestra Familia criminal enterprise in California. Not La Mesa. Not 5 generals. One man. One voice. One command structure flowing from a single Pelican Bay cell downward through regiment captains across the state to thousands of Nortino street soldiers who answered to his authority. David Cervantes was from Chino, California, in San Bernardino County, the Inland Empire, which placed him geographically closer to the Southern California border than to the Northern California heartland that had historically produced Nuestra Familia's leadership. That distinction was not insignificant within an organization whose entire identity was built around the North-South divide. And yet Cervantes had navigated the organization's internal politics with sufficient skill to emerge from the most chaotic power struggle in Nuestra Familia's history as its sole general. According to documented accounts from law enforcement officials who tracked his activities, Cervantes paid particular attention to Salinas. The Salinas Valley had long been Nuestra Familia's most concentrated operational territory, a city with one of the highest rates of gang violence in California, whose streets had been under Nortino influence for decades. Cervantes, according to investigators, kept a keen eye on Salinas' affairs and used his consolidated authority to direct operations in that city with the same systematic attention that his predecessors had brought to the organization's broader Northern California networks. The remaining leadership structure at Pelican Bay below Cervantes consisted of Daniel Perez of Salinas, Anthony Guillen of San Jose, and George Franco, who was responsible for the gang's activities in Stockton, Tracy, and Fresno. Together, these 4 men, all confined inside the security housing unit at Pelican Bay, represented the reconstituted command structure of an organization that law enforcement had spent 3 years and $5 million attempting to dismantle. In April 2010, federal and local law enforcement agencies concluded what officials described as the most significant effort to dismantle the Central Coast leadership structure of Nuestra Familia since Operation Black Widow itself. The operation targeted the Salinas Regiment specifically, the regiment that Cervantes had kept under closest personal supervision. The results of that 2010 operation, and the subsequent federal prosecutions it generated, produced additional convictions, additional sentences, and additional documentation of the organization's continued operation from inside Pelican Bay. David Cervantes, as of the time of this documentary, remains incarcerated at Pelican Bay State Prison. He is still formally recognized within Nuestra Familia's organizational structure as its senior general. A small percentage of the gang continues to defer to the exiled generals in Colorado. The majority answer to Cervantes. The organization has not stopped. Now the final story of this documentary. His name was Rico Garcia. And his story is, in certain respects, the most instructive of all the cases examined here. Because Rico Garcia was not a general. He was not a founding figure or an organizational architect. He was a captain. A regiment-level leader from Windsor, California, a small town in Sonoma County, in the heart of Northern California wine country, about as far from the Central Valley fields that had produced Nuestra Familia's founding generation as it was possible to be while still remaining in the organization's territory. But what Rico Garcia did, and what happened to him as a result, illuminates something essential about the way these organizations work and the way the men inside them are consumed by what they build. Rico Garcia's street name was Smiley. According to court records, Garcia was an active member of Nuestra Familia operating under the direction of the organization's Pelican Bay-based leadership during the late 1990s. His documented role placed him as a regiment-level operative, below the generals, but above the street-level soldiers. He was, according to court documentation, the kind of man the generals used to carry out the operations they directed from inside the SHU. In 1998, a Nuestra Familia captain named Michael Castillo, known as Micchio, became a problem for the organization's leadership. Castillo had been caught in the middle of a power struggle between two of Nuestra Familia's Nuestro generals. The specific nature of his transgression, whether it was a perceived act of disloyalty, an unauthorized operation, a financial dispute, or some combination of these things, is not fully detailed in public court records. What is documented is the outcome. The imprisoned NF leadership ordered Castillo's assassination. According to court documents and investigative reporting, Rico Garcia executed that order personally. He met with Castillo, a man he knew, a man within the same organization, and shot him to death. The killing was not random. It was not an act of street violence born from a spontaneous confrontation. It was an organizational execution, carried out on direct instruction from generals who were sitting inside Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit at the time the order was issued. Law enforcement officials who investigated Castillo's murder noted that the killing had an unintended consequence that its architects inside Pelican Bay had not fully anticipated. The assassination brought Salinas law enforcement and the FBI into direct contact with the intelligence that would eventually seed the Operation Black Widow investigation. The murder of a Nuestra Familia captain, carried out on orders from inside a maximum security prison, became one of the triggering events for the largest gang prosecution in Northern California history. Rico Garcia was indicted as part of Operation Black Widow. He faced the death penalty for the 1998 Salinas killing of Michael Castillo. The federal government's stated intent was to seek execution. Garcia did not go to trial. According to documented court records, Garcia entered a guilty plea to murder. In exchange for his cooperation in his plea, the death penalty was taken off the table. He received a stipulated sentence of life in state prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving that sentence. He will not leave prison alive. The man who pulled the trigger on Michael Castillo's life, on direct orders from generals sitting in a concrete box in Crescent City, is now himself confined in a concrete box, serving a sentence that mirrors in its permanence the permanence of what he did on a Salinas street in 1998. What the case of Rico Garcia reveals, when placed alongside the 6 stories that preceded it in this documentary, is something that prosecutors, corrections officials, and researchers have documented consistently across decades of organized crime prosecution in California. The men at the bottom of these organizations, the captains, the regiment commanders, the operatives who carry out the orders issued from inside the SHU, bear the full legal consequence of violence that was planned by men they will never equal in organizational standing. Garcia pulled the trigger. The generals who ordered the killing were already serving life sentences when they issued the order. They had nothing additional to lose. Garcia had his freedom. He no longer has it. Twist ending. Here is what most people watching this documentary do not know. In 2015, California reached a landmark settlement in the class action lawsuit Ashka versus Governor of California. The suit, brought by inmates confined in Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit, argued that long-term solitary confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the United States Constitution. A federal judge agreed. And California agreed to dramatically reform its use of long-term isolation, transferring the vast majority of SHU inmates into general population, ending the practice of indefinite solitary confinement based on gang validation alone. The 5 generals of Nuestra Familia had already been removed from Pelican Bay before that settlement. Joe Morgan was dead. Rene Enriquez was still imprisoned but had left the SHU through his cooperation agreement. Michael Lerma had been transferred to federal custody. But the settlement and the reforms it required raise a question that has not been fully answered by any subsequent investigation. If the security housing unit at Pelican Bay was the operational headquarters of 2 of the most powerful criminal organizations in California history, if it was the room from which Morgan directed LAIM's expansion, Enriquez coordinated the taxing of 60,000 gang members, Lerma ran an extortion empire across 2 counties, and Rubalcaba ordered the assassination of sitting prosecutors, then what exactly did the SHU produce? The California Department of Corrections built it as a solution. The federal prosecutions documented it as a problem. And the lawyers who sued on behalf of its inmates argued it was a human rights violation. All 3 of those things are simultaneously true. The SHU did not create these organizations. But it gave their leaders something that general population prison could never provide: total separation from the noise and unpredictability of ordinary prison life, combined with the organizational authority that came from being identified as the most dangerous man in the system. Placement in the SHU was not a punishment these men feared. For some of them, according to documented accounts, it was a mark of status. Evidence that the institution recognized how dangerous they were. That recognition translated directly into organizational credibility on the streets outside. The system designed to contain them became the credential that elevated them. And then California dismantled the system. What replaced it? General population housing for men who had previously spent decades in isolation, mixed into prison environments where their organizational authority had not diminished and where their ability to communicate freely with other inmates had dramatically increased, is a question that California corrections officials, law enforcement agencies, and researchers are still working to fully answer. The machine did not stop when the SHU was reformed. It adapted. It has always adapted. If this documentary has given you something to think about, leave a comment below. Tell us which of these stories stayed with you. Joe Morgan, a Croatian immigrant son from San Pedro who became the first non-Hispanic member of the Mexican Mafia, built a transnational criminal organization from inside a prison cell, and died of cancer at Corcoran before the state's life sentence could be served. Rene Enriquez, the South Central soldier who rose to LAIM's highest ranks, ran drug networks covering 60,000 gang members from inside Pelican Bay's SHU, then walked away from the organization and spent the years since living under a permanent death sentence issued by the family he betrayed. Michael Lerma, the Pomona kid who joined his neighborhood gang at 12, served 26 years in solitary confinement, and according to federal prosecutors never stopped directing robberies, extortion, kidnappings, and murders from inside that pale yellow cell. Gerald Rubalcaba, the Nuestra general who kept a master hit list of 50 names on his person at all times, ordered the assassination of 2 sitting prosecutors from inside the SHU, and was ultimately removed from California entirely through a legal mechanism so unusual it required a governor's signature and a state Supreme Court ruling. James Moato, the Hanford general who pleaded guilty to racketeering in 2 murders, was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, and whose 20-year-old common-law wife was found shot to death on a remote highway near Gilroy within months of his removal from California. David Cervantes, the man who emerged from Nuestra Familia's post-Black Widow power struggle as its sole general, the first single leader the organization had operated under in decades, directing Northern California's Nortino networks from a Pelican Bay cell. Rico Garcia, the Windsor captain who pulled the trigger on a fellow Nuestra Familia member on direct orders from generals already serving life sentences, traded his own freedom for a plea that kept him off death row, and is now serving life without parole for a killing he was instructed to commit by men who had nothing left to lose. 7 men. 2 organizations. 1 facility. And a decades-long documented record of criminal command exercised from inside the most restrictive incarceration environment the state of California ever built. The system built to silence them gave them something to say. And the streets of California have been listening ever since. If you want to understand how that system is being rebuilt, and what the next generation of organizational leadership inside California's prisons looks like right now, that story is documented in our next video. It begins where this one ends.